Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to day number 2 of the Climate Friendly Travel Summer School. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm Jeff Lippman. I'm the president of SunX Malta and the course director for this summer school, and I'll be taking you through the lecture today. Again, as with yesterday, we've put together a selection of guest speakers, many of them who have been lecturing at the recent Strong Earth Youth Summit that we held, and we've inserted these clips throughout the day and tried to give you a lively as well as an informative experience. Today, we're going to dig deeper into the climate issues. Yesterday, we had a long discussion about Maurice Strong and his incredible inspirational impact on so many people in his lifetime, and his contribution to the United Nations, what we call green and clean roadmap for the better future. The green being the Sustainable Development Goals and the clean being the Paris Climate Agreement. And we tried to show how Maurice Strong had put together the architecture of this system and how in 1972, 50 years ago, he was arguing that climate change was the defining existential issue of our times, and how we've now got to the stage where we're approaching COP26 in Glasgow, the 26th conference of the parties since the climate convention was put into force in the mid-1990s. And we discussed in our question and answers people's reaction to this. And today we're going to dig deeper and we're going to look at the climate crisis. Yesterday we finished by looking at the Sustainable Development Goal component of the roadmap. And today we're going to look at the climate component. To give the context, it's widely recognized that climate change is existential now, that it results from man-made industrial greenhouse emissions, largely caused by the burning of fossil fuel for transportation, for heating, for industrial energy, and that we need to keep global temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees by 2050, if civilization as we know it is to survive. Travel and tourism is a major socio-economic driver. It produces from 5 to 8% of the carbon. It can and must and seemingly wants to play a leading role in looking at response strategies, both in terms of emission reduction for the medium to long term, critically important, and in terms of resilience to extreme weather-related incidents that are occurring everywhere in the world. Floods in Europe this last year, the recent hurricane in the United States, forest fires in California, the Siberian tundra beginning to melt. All of these developments are also affecting travel and tourism significantly. And some of us are arguing that when this escalates to an even higher level, it will be a crisis which only is greater than the COVID crisis is now. So I want you to think in terms of the drama, the political drama and the travel difficulties that are emerging because of COVID look at the climate crisis as COVID on steroids. This short-term weather reality and disaster reality is increasingly driving public recognition and political support for change. And science-based reasoning and action are becoming of greater importance. People are understanding that there is a scientific dimension to these changes and that we need to listen to what the scientists are telling us. Now, to cover this today, we have two short and somewhat overlapping presentations from leading scientists in the tourism field. We're going to start with Susanna Beckham. Susanna is a professor at Griffith University in Australia, and she's living in New Zealand and working with the New Zealand Department of Environment at the same time. She's a winner of UNWTO's annual Ulysses Award for Academic Excellence. And Susanna was a lead author on the UNWTO 2005 landmark study that was the first to assess the carbon impacts of travel and tourism. And I was involved during that period as Assistant Secretary General at UNWTO, and I can vouch for the incredible lucidity and the incredible commitment of that team that we had working on that program, and Susanna was really one of the lead artists in this. So if we could start off with Susanna's presentation, that would be great.
Hi everybody, my name is Susanna Beckham. I'm a professor.
Can you hear?
But it's not showing well. It's not showing the video properly.
We can hear, but we can't see the video.
Okay, just a minute, please.
Hi everybody, my name is Susanna Beckham. I'm a professor of sustainable tourism at Griffith University in Australia and also at the University of Surrey in the UK, and I work for the Department of Conservation in New Zealand. I'm speaking in the moment from New Zealand, and it's great to be part of this Youth Summit to share a few updates on the climate crisis. Now, I will actually start by referring to the latest climate report that has come out. There's obviously constantly updates by various organizations, and unfortunately, every time there's more information, it's pointing towards faster change than expected and more severe impact. So the latest one is from the Climate Council in Australia, authored by Stefan and his team, and the title is Aim High, Go Fast, Why Emissions Need to Plummet This Decade. And essentially, this is the first report that says that we probably, well, it's basically to, we're locked into a warming of 1.5 degrees. We cannot reach that threshold or maintain a warming to that level without significantly sort of overshooting and then withdrawing for various technologies or carbon sequestration. So the report estimates that we probably reach 1.5 degrees by 2030, and that's even if we essentially stop emitting now. So that is quite bad news because some of you may remember there was a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018. It was the and famous 1.5 degree report, and it provided quite a lot of detail on the difference that a 1.5 degree warming would make as opposed to 2 degrees. And of course, you would know that 2 degrees is essentially what people countries agreed to in the Paris Climate Agreement, knowing that really we should strive for 1.5 because the 2 may already be too hard. So for example, with 2 degrees, we will essentially lose all the coral reefs in the world, 99% of them. If we manage to stay within the 1.5, we might be able to get away with a decline of 70 to 90%. Now that's a pretty bad decline as well. So even the 1.5 already obviously will result in major changes to this planet. Now, this particular Climate Council report essentially says every fraction of a degree of avoided warming matters, and it will be measured in lives, species, and ecosystems saved. We must do everything possible to deeply and rapidly cut our emissions while also preparing for the changes that can no longer be avoided. Now, every degree of warming saved, the reason this is important is because sometimes it's easy to think, well, what can we do? It's all too late. Well, it's never too late, because 2 degrees is still better than 3 degrees, or 3 degrees is still better than 4 degrees. So it is really, really important to make sure we can do everything we can. Now, where are we at though with the climate action? Yes, a lot is happening. Yes, we can read success stories. Is it enough? Is it fast enough? No, it's not. So we know that even most country pledges in their so-called nationally determined contributions are far failing the changes we need. Importantly, you often hear net zero by 2050, and even some of the statements made in the tourism sector, 2050 is sort of the goal towards which some work, and that's the more ambitious ones. It's too late. We have basically a decade to drastically reduce emissions. Now, for example, I'm calling from New Zealand. Our climate targets in the moment are completely insufficient. We have a Zero Carbon Act, which is quite world leading, but what needs to come now is the action that underpins it and that makes it happen rather fast. This includes also aviation, and I will talk about that in a minute. International aviation is outside the Paris Agreement. It's addressed for a sector initiative led by ICAO, essentially the UN body for aviation. It is not on the path that we need. In fact, a recent report by the UN Environment shows that if aviation continues to grow as it did, it will make up 60% up to 220% of permissible emissions by 2050. And that is quite a conservative estimate. Now, I came across a quote which summarizes it quite nicely. It's from a US climate commentator and meteorologist, Eric Holthaus. He says there's no tangible difference between now saying climate change is a hoax and now saying climate change is real, but they don't do anything. In both cases, it's denial. And so I would agree with that, just saying, yes, I know, but not doing everything we possibly can to make the changes essentially results in the same outcome. Now, a brief comment on COVID. COVID has led to a short-term reduction in carbon emissions, about 7% in 2020, and it maybe has demonstrated to us that we can change. However, already economies are starting to bounce back, and the challenge we have now is that governments have committed substantial amounts, in fact, unprecedented resources to COVID response and recovery. And the future of decarbonization, including for travel and tourism, depends on how those resources are used. Unfortunately, at this point, the United Nations Environment Programme finds that only 18% of recovery spending is somewhat green. And in respect to aviation, for example, only 2 out of 50 countries that have bailed out their airlines have imposed some form of environmental conditionality. That's France and Austria. Now, what are we doing in tourism? knowing that tourism is quite a vulnerable sector, is quite exposed to climate impacts. It's also obviously a discretionary activity. So if economies go down because of climate change, tourism will suffer. And of course, it's carbon intensive. So any changes in climate policy will affect the sector. So it is important to be proactive and to acknowledge that tourism contributes anything between 5 or 8% to global man-made emissions. There's now global decarbonization plan for tourism, and I'm not aware of many countries that would have one. Tourism falls sort of between the cracks sometimes. There's a bit of transport, there's a bit of commercial sector or built environments, but there's now particular targets. And in fact, target setting, climate, carbon reporting in tourism is not where it should be. It is lagging behind compared with other sectors. There are things that can be done. And in fact, coming back to that Climate Commission report, need to be done urgently and in an integrative way. So that involves governments, industry, and the travelers. And it requires substantial change. So for aviation, for example, it's a combination out of course, maximizing efficiencies in the system through technology and operations, but it is also investing heavily into alternative fuels. That can only happen with the help of governments and through enabling policy like a blend-in mandate, for example, for synthetic fuel, and also probably core investment, because moving from fossil fuel to alternative fuels is a huge step that probably the industry will not be able to do it, especially given that most airlines have pretty much used up their cash reserves. It will also affect prices, and as a result, of course, travel behavior. People may fly less far, less often, and holiday a bit closer to home. Now, that's not a bad thing. We have seen through COVID that actually a lot of countries were able to compensate the loss of international tourism for an increase in domestic activity. Now, we then still need to look at domestic transport networks, electrification, maybe investment. New Zealand, for example, has invested quite heavily into cycle parks, and maybe there needs to be a move towards more collective forms of transport. An interesting one is food and beverage. There's a lot of food wastage in tourism, and with that come a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, both from the waste itself, but also the production. So there is quite some low-hanging fruit that the sector hasn't exploited. Now, to wrap up, why is it not moving ahead? What's lacking? Well, number one, I'd say, is the political will. It takes quite a strong vision and ability to implement it. The governance structures for tourism, international aviation is a classic one, where we have not been able to actually make progress. Second one is probably around investment and green finance. We need to invest in low carbon infrastructure, and that will cost a lot of money, and we need innovation for that. And the third one might be accepting change, whether that's businesses and maybe their performance measures, and that's also how we holiday. Where do we go? How often? What travel style? What's important? And that is a much bigger picture of maybe a shift away from consumerism to other values that are decoupled from carbon and material consumption. So with that, I close and leave you with that urgent call for action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna, as ever. And we're going to follow this with a second presentation from Professor Daniel Scott, who is a professor of climate action at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And Daniel was also one of the lead authors on the 2005 UNWTO study. And he's going to take us a little bit more into the numbers behind the conclusion that travel and tourism produced 5% of global carbon emissions. If you're ready to play the video, that would be great.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Scott. I'm a professor and research chair at the University of Waterloo here in Canada, and also the University of Surrey in the UK. It's my sincere pleasure to be with you and an honor to contribute to Maurice Strong's legacy through this event. Jeffrey's asked me to get us started this morning with a discussion of how the climate crisis will reshape tourism over the next 30 years. And in true Jeffrey style, he gave me 7 minutes to cover this colossal topic. So I'll do the best that I can in the time that we've got. As these images I'll show you, climate change is not some future risk for tourism. It's upon us. And you as the next generation of travelers, but more importantly, as tourism leaders, have a massively important role in creating the climate-friendly travel that we all want to see happen. First, I want to put the climate crisis in a bit of context of what we're facing now. While COVID has been absolutely crushing for the tourism sector, the rebound has begun in some parts of the world, and by this time next year, we should all be back together, and so too will the world of travel. And we must resist that feeling of everything that's wrong now is going to stay wrong. It won't. And defeatism is just as paralyzing to progress as climate denial. And so the long transformative journey that's required by climate change demands our sort of collective, determined resolve to work through not just this COVID period, but the long journey to a net zero economy and tourism of the future. You've probably all seen a figure like this that outlines our choices on climate futures. You know, at the top is a +3 or +4 world, a world that we all agree we don't want, but the path that we're still on. We have a light blue path in the middle that if the current Paris Climate Agreement pledges are met, we'd land there. And at the bottom is that darker blue color. That's the +2 world that we've all agreed we want to work towards. So what does that mean for tourism? Well, both of the most important point is that both of these futures, whether it's we achieve +2 or a +3 or higher world, are going to transform tourism in 2 ways. Challenge 1, carbon risk. How do we decarbonize tourism over the next 30 years so it can have a place in that net zero economy of mid-century, the 2050s or so? And challenge 2, climate risk. We're going to have to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate that we're committed to based on past and ongoing emissions. And how do we do that and foster a more sustainable and also a more just tourism economy? And so we'll focus on these 2 key challenges briefly, starting with the world that we want to see, and what are the implications of this net zero transition that more and more countries, businesses, and the tourism sector have committed themselves to. This figure on the right shows tourism's emissions, which are estimated about 5 or 8% of global totals. It also shows the growth trajectory if we do nothing. And at the bottom of that figure in the blue colors, those are the ambitions that the WTTC and other tourism leaders who have declared a climate emergency, that's where we want to be. So this is the big gap that we have to overcome. The question is, how do we do that? And what's really important to emphasize is there are scalable solutions to make this transition happen. We don't need any new technologies necessarily. We need to improve some of the ones that we have, get their costs down. And we need policy and we need investment to make that happen so that all of these examples that I've shown you here, that becomes the norm, not the exception. And we also have to do this, importantly, not just to decarbonize our operations and our travel, but to demonstrate to world leaders that tourism can be part of that net zero economy of mid-century. We need a detailed plan of how we're going to do that, because right now tourism is being overlooked by all of the experts and the policymakers that are getting together to make the policy for a +2 compatible energy future. And that's really dangerous for tourism not to be at the table. It won't be easy, it won't be cheap, but we must look at this as an investment in our social license to operate in a carbon-constrained world, not purely just as a cost. So now let's briefly consider that world that we don't want, a climate-disrupted economy and society is just incompatible with tourism development that we all want to see, and very incompatible with sustainable tourism. Now, today we don't have time to go through the wide range of impacts that are shown here and on other slides, from sea level rise to weather extremes, to economic growth, to security risks. So instead, we're going to look at, well, what do all of these impacts, if they're combined, what do they mean for different parts of the world in terms of tourism? And this map that I'll show you here is a map of the combined climate and carbon risk as best as we can estimate it today, using 27 different indicators, looking at 180 some countries. The first thing that jumps out at you from this map is how uneven the impact or the risk is. And you'll probably see very quickly how unfair the impacts are to some parts of the world that have contributed least to the problem that we're facing. The highest risk exists in the regions where tourism growth is expected to be the strongest. So climate change is going to pose a headwind to tourism development in parts of Southeast Asia, much of Africa, and many parts of Latin America as well. Even more important, when we look at these impacts or these risks through a climate justice lens, we see that many countries that depend on tourism for progress on the SDGs are amongst those most at risk. If you look in the upper right quadrant at many of these countries, many are small island developing states. Others are least developed countries. And we can't lose sight of this as we develop strategies to adapt and decarbonize the tourism sector. We can't lose sight of climate justice as well. So with that high level context, I want to leave you with two key messages. One, there can be no sustainable tourism and no tourism contribution to the SDGs if we fail on climate. It must be a priority for our research, our training, our policy, our investment, and our business planning. And the second point is, a very wise man once reminded us, don't accept that you can't make a difference. What we do as individuals matters. It adds up, as he said. And over the last few years, youth of the world have really found their voice on climate. So I encourage you, continue to be loud, push what is politically possible, closer to what is scientifically necessary. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and now I'll turn it over to Walter. Thank you.
Well, first, let me apologize for the clarity or the poor clarity of the visuals that we've just seen. Several people have mentioned in the chat how important it is that they're able to look at this, and ask that we send out a clean version of this afterwards, and we will do that. And again, sorry about the fact that it didn't come out clearly. I just want to make a couple of points, actually. One point that Suzanne made, which I think is very important, is that defeatism is as bad as denial. In other words, we know where the climate deniers are, and we know that many of them are coming from people with a vested interest in keeping their current business as usual situation, particularly the big oil companies, for example. And it's increasingly becoming clear that they have been putting in place pseudo academic studies to indicate that things are not as bad as the scientists would have us believe. And I can only say that from our perspective at SunX Malta, we believe that things are bad, and we think that they're going to get worse. And that's why we have to be putting in place resilient strategies as well as long-term emission strategies. So that's point number one. And point two is a point I think it was Daniel made, that it's important that tourism has a seat at the table. And in the big global decision-making activities, and whilst it's unlikely that it will have a primary seat. That's going to be made by political leadership. We're going to see that in the UN, in the G7, in the African Union, and in all of those places. But it's very important that the tourism perspective is given so that those leaders can see how their decisions will not just impact on the tourism sector, but will come back and impact on their economies. And there's really no better example than COVID for that. So with that, I want to thank Susanna and Daniel for those presentations. They were both given at the recent SAIS conference, which was last September, so they're relatively current, and they do give a clear indication of the situation. Now we're going to turn more in depth into the travel and tourism sector. We're going to look at some of the different activities of different suppliers and providers of tourism services. Obviously, we're going to start with transport, and we're going to start with aviation, because without aviation, certainly there can be no or hardly any intercontinental tourism, and arguably there would be a massive incapacity for tourism if we didn't have the world's aviation network. We have a presentation here which was given again very recently to our SAIS conference by Paul Steele. Paul is a former secretary of IATA, the International Air Transport Association. He was also the the co-creator of the current airline industry strategy that I am sure we are going to see changed in the run-up to Glasgow, because it's what I've described elsewhere as a Neanderthal strategy. The airlines collectively, one of the most sophisticated industries on the planet, using certainly some of the most sophisticated technology on the planet, have been telling us for many years that they will only be able to reduce their emissions to half of the 2005 levels by 2050. And any reasonable analysis of that says that's just lobbying for business as usual. And I'm absolutely sure that in the run-up to Glasgow, and with the new Director General in IATA, Willie Walsh, the former head of the IAG group, they have got an activist there. IAG have already talked about being carbon neutral by, I think, 2040. So I expect to see some changes there, and it's necessary, because if we are going to be describing ourselves as a leading edge global sector, we also need to be positioning ourselves to be at the leading edge of our responsibilities. So with that, I'm going to ask that you play Paul Steele's video.
Hi everyone, my name's Paul Steele. I'm an independent consultant, but in my former career, I was the Corporate Secretary and Director of Environment for the International Air Transport Association, the Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group, and the Chief Operating Officer of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF International. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to explain to you how the aviation sector is looking towards full decarbonisation by the third quarter of this century. It's an enormous challenge, particularly at the present time, given that the industry has suffered probably the worst crisis in its over 100-year history with the impact of the current COVID pandemic. But nevertheless, the industry continues to work to reduce its impact on the environment, particularly in the realm of CO2 emissions, and we'll explore the plans that they have and look at some of the challenges that the industry is facing in trying to reach that zero carbon goal. The scope of the challenge facing the industry can be clearly seen on this chart from the Air Transport Action Group's Waypoint 2050 report. Despite the impacts of COVID and all the best efforts of the industry to improve fuel efficiency and reduce CO2 emissions, all of the predictions are that without further action, emissions will continue to grow, driven by increases in demand, particularly from developing countries. That is why, way back in 2009, the aviation industry came together and set itself some, what at the time were very ambitious targets. First of all, to improve annual fuel efficiency by 1.5% every year between 2009 and 2020. That may not sound a lot, but that was on top of a 60% improvement that had already been achieved since the beginning of the jet age. The second goal was to stabilize net emissions at the 2020 levels with what was called carbon neutral growth. Even though traffic was forecast to continue to grow, the ambition was to stabilize emissions at the 2020 level. And then looking further forward into the future, the objective was to halve emissions to 50% of the level that they were at in 2005. And for a number of years, these are the targets that the industry has been following. So how is the industry doing? Well, on that first goal of improving fuel efficiency, not bad. This chart shows you the progression every year from 2008 to 2019. And you can see at the bottom right that on average they've achieved 2% per annum rather than the 1.5% that the industry originally set out to do. And on the medium-term goal, things have not progressed too badly either. Back in 2016, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the UN body encompassing 192 countries, agreed on the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, known as CORSIA. This aimed to stabilize emissions from 2020 by implementing a basket of measures to reduce emissions, but then to offset any additional growth in emissions above the 2020 level. This has been implemented, and even despite the COVID impacts, it's on course to be implemented and to go into operation as of this year. As far as I'm aware, CORSIA is still the only global agreement for an individual industry sector that's been put in place and is actually being implemented. This means that all of the focus now turns towards trying to achieve the longer term 2050 goal, and of course to try and move as quickly as possible towards a zero carbon future for aviation. The industry has had a 4-pillar strategy, as it's known, in place for a number of years. Those 4 pillars are driving technological development, improving infrastructure to make sure that you reduce delays and reduce fuel burn, improving flying operational techniques, and a market-based measure, which of course was already put in place through CORSIA. Now, of course, the major benefits will come through future technology developments. And of course, this is something that the industry puts a lot of time, effort, and invests a lot of research money into. So moving forward through the middle of the century, we can expect to see some revolutionary technologies starting to appear. But again, is this going to be fast enough in terms of new aircraft or engine designs to really deliver carbon neutrality by the third quarter of this century? You can see the size of the challenge on this slide here. If you look at everything below the thick blue line, that is what needs to be done in order to reach the industry's original target of half the 2005 level of emissions by 2050. That's a combination of CORSIA, which is the purple piece in the middle, and technology, operational infrastructure improvements, as we can see. but also there's a large component of alternative fuel that needs to come into play. So we will start to see some of those revolutionary aircraft and engine designs coming into the fleet in around 2035 or 2040. But again, that won't be enough to deliver carbon neutrality by the third quarter of the century. So the focus is moving more and more towards looking at alternative fuels for aviation. The challenge that we have is that jet kerosene, derived from fossil fuels, is a perfect fuel for aviation. It doesn't freeze at low temperature, it doesn't ignite at high temperature, it's light, and it has a very high energy ratio. It's the perfect fuel if you're trying to fly around the world. But increasingly, there's more and more focus on looking at alternative fuels for aviation. And two of the most exciting here are hydrogen and, in the short to medium term, sustainable alternative fuels made from largely waste products. These types of fuels derived from waste products shouldn't be confused with the original types of biofuels that were produced from crops and therefore had all sorts of issues in terms of land use and water resource use, etc. Most of the fuels that have been developed for use in aviation have been derived from household waste or industrial waste, and it looks like that is a huge opportunity going forward. The great news is that all of the hard technical development and safety testing has been done, and we know that we can mix these fuels with existing kerosene, so as they become available we can add more and more into the tanks of aircraft. There are now 6 approved different pathways for producing sustainable aviation fuel, and there are no changes that are needed to the aircraft or the engines when you're using this fuel. So it really is a very, very exciting opportunity. Already well over 300,000 flights have taken place with a mix of these types of fuels, so it is tried and tested. The challenge now, of course, is scaling up from what has been laboratory level production up to full industrial scale of production and distribution of these fuels. The great news is that things are really starting to move. There are a number of plants being built at scale around the world, and there are more and more of these being announced all the time, driven largely by partnerships between completely new fuel suppliers and individual airlines. This is certainly very encouraging, but is it developing fast enough to really enable the industry to even think about zero carbon by the third quarter of the century? Unfortunately, probably not. The biggest single factor slowing down the future growth and potential of sustainable alternative fuels for aviation is a lack of government policy, coherent government policy. Many governments around the world have been very slow to recognize the opportunity that alternative fuels for aviation will provide. We need governments to think holistically so that they're able to converge their energy, climate and transport policies, and then they would see that alternative fuels for aviation are a no-brainer. Unfortunately, achieving this type of forward thinking is difficult even at a national level, let alone internationally, which is what is going to be needed for a truly global industry like aviation. So governments need a nudge, and this is where people like Professor Jeffrey Lippman come into play. Jeffrey has promoted what he's called moonshot thinking, saying we should have a moonshot. We should do what John Kennedy did when he said, "I want to put a man on the moon." We need visionaries like Jeffrey to help nudge people forward, to bring financial institutions, manufacturers, scientists and governments together so that they can think big and we can fully exploit this opportunity of sustainable alternative fuels for aviation that are available now. It's really just a question of scaling up, because if we're able to deliver on this, then we can secure more or less a zero carbon future for the aviation sector by the third quarter of this century.
Thank you very much, Paul. Actually, I don't need to thank Paul because, as you could see, that's a video that he recorded for the SAIS conference again. I sometimes see these videos almost for the first time when you see them for the second or third time. And I don't think you could have had a clearer presentation of the view from the airlines. And there's a lot of logic, apart from his nice words to me at the end of it, I started to talk about a moonshot maybe 4 years ago when I was asked to give the keynote at the Arab Air Carriers President's meeting in Saudi Arabia. And it was just at the time of the Paris Climate Agreement. And in fact, it was 2015 in December. And nothing, Dr. Johnson says, nothing so concentrates the mind as the prospect of being hanged on the morrow. And if you hang tomorrow, if you have to give a major speech to a major group and talk in something relevant to their area, that's when you really focus yourself. And the moonshot idea emerged from that kind of thinking. And Paul has encapsulated it, as usual, more simply and in a better way. But the story is simply that if travel and tourism is as important as we believe it is to the world economy and to socioeconomic development, if travel and tourism, at least intercontinentally, is largely driven by air transport, you can't swim across the North Atlantic Ocean. If that's the case, then not to do something to make sure that air transport can play its part in the essential transformation to deal with an existential problem is totally maniacal. And as a society, this isn't a tourism thing, it's a society thing. We've seen how when you stop the flying in COVID, you dump half of the value of economies that's coming from travel and tourism. So here's this pivotal crossover point. Here's this sector which is going to push travel and tourism to a higher relative contribution if we don't fix it. You have these two big industries, and you have the aviation, transport and tourism industry. You have the fossil fuel providers, and the language that they're talking about is the kind of language that Einstein used when he said, if you keep, the definition of madness is when you keep doing the same thing over and over and you think you're going to get a different result. It's absolutely imperative that some of the billions of dollars that are being spent on prospecting for new fuel, which is only going to make the pollution worse, be spent on highest level research in aviation propulsion, so that we can get something like sustainable aviation fuel that Paul referred to and have it everywhere. Now, since that time, I have to say Boeing have said that their aircraft will all be SAF compliant. They'll all be able to take drop-in sustainable aviation fuel. Drop-in means that you don't have to change the tanks and the filling system. It's essentially as if you were using aviation gas but changing it to a sustainable fuel. And elsewhere, many years ago, Sir Richard Branson said that dealing with this issue is a no-brainer because there are only 1,800 at the time. There are more now, but there's only a couple of thousand filling stations around the planet. I mean, that's the airports of the world. And the airports have declared themselves that they're going to be the leaders in a carbon-free society. They've also said that doesn't actually include the flying. And that's why you need to get everybody together. You need to get the airports, the airlines, the governments, the environment ministries, the energy ministries, the tourism ministries, with this single goal of, as a first step, getting safe, sustainable aviation fuel immediately available in much larger quantities and as much as is needed, say by 2030, one of those way stations on the roadmap to the future, as much as is needed. And if that means that BP and Exxon, BP has to live up to its name of beyond petroleum, and Exxon has to stop funding lobbyists in Washington to give out questionable data on climate change, and put all that money and all that research into solving, as step one, a sustainable aviation fuel for the world's airlines, the travel and tourism industry, and the global economy. And step two is we have to find a better way of keeping the airplanes flying, which doesn't create pollution. And there, Airbus have said that by 20, and you only have a small handful of major manufacturers you're dealing with here, two big ones in Airbus and Boeing, and a number of small ones like Embraer in Brazil and the Chinese industry, which is now developing very quickly. And so it's rational when Airbus say by 2035, which is what they've said, we will have a hydrogen-powered high technology blended wing, they call it. It's like a big V. It's totally different from the way modern aircraft look. When they say they're going to put the research and development and manufacturing and all of that into this, that's where we need to be focusing attention. And you need a moonshot. You need all of these different entities to come together and say, this is our strategic goal. This is the plan to get there, and to put their money into that area of activity. And if I can stay on my high horse and hobby horse for a moment, if you take a country like the United Kingdom, which is a major player in aerospace and a big engine provider in Rolls-Royce, one of the major engine providers, that country is collecting a toll from passengers called the airport passenger duty, which goes from travelers deep into the treasury of the United Kingdom and never goes anywhere near the travel and tourism sector. Well, if the chairman of COP26 or the host, Boris Johnson, would like to put his money where his nice words are, he could make a gesture and take the airport passenger duty and say, I'm taking that £4 billion a year, which is coming every year, and I'm starting a fund for sustainable aviation. Bang. And we have to hope that Mr. Johnson and his cabinet, when they're searching around for things that they can look good about in Glasgow, maybe he'd put that on his agenda. So we've had a morning's lecture. We're going to do a break now. And once again, we're going to show you another dodo cartoon. We got a terrific reaction to the dodo cartoon yesterday. And this isn't something we've created at SunX Malta, so I'm not, singing our own song. But I'm very pleased for Nicola Fury, who's in hospital at the moment and has been for a little while. She's been pushing this dodo since I was certainly living in Geneva, which is 20 years ago. And that's when we first came together to look at it. And it was such a good reaction. If anybody in this audience is interested in helping us promote this, please drop us a line. It's our intention to take one of our hardworking and visionary students and make this a project for them to work on as a kind of manager of that program, if we can get enough interest in it from the outside world. So with that, I don't know, are you ready to show that video now?
Just a minute, we're just like Just give us
Just give me a
a
sec.
minute or two. Yeah, thank you.
Would you like me to try to show it?
No, it's fine, Jeffrey. I'm almost ready.
Dodo, come back. I can Dodo do this. Dodo, come back. I can Dodo do that. Dodo, come back. But I wanna see what you can do. You know it's all I do. Dodo, come back.
Now what's the matter with him? I better take a look. Hey, what's the matter? Are you okay?
I'm so lonely.
But I'm here and I'm your friend.
Do you know how to play rummy?
No.
Whist? Snap?
Nope.
I've got no one to play with. I'm lonely.
That's it. If you don't like the friends you've got, make some new ones, sunshine.
New friends? Hey, that's an idea. Now, where on earth did I put it? Here it is. That's what I need. 2 or 3 friends of my own species. This house is big enough. They could all live here. We could all play cards all night long. Yes.
But you told me you were the last dodo on Earth.
Did I?
An extinct species. Exterminated.
Did I say that? That's awful.
Oh, don't stop crying again. Look, blow your beak and come with me. Let's go and check it out.
Told you so. Look, a friend. Wow! Ow! What's your name? Mine's Dodo. Put it there and give me 5. It's great to meet you. Yes.
Hey, calm down. Can't you see this thing's made of wood?
I'm hallucinating. It can't be.
A what?
A dodo. This is incredible.
Sure, I'm a dodo. Why not?
There haven't been dodos here for 300 years.
Oh, really? Why not?
Exterminated.
Oh, yeah? By who?
By the people who discovered this island.
And nobody stopped them doing it?
Animal rights didn't exist then.
Oh, no, why not?
All right, mate, that's enough. You're making me dizzy. If you want me to tell you the story of your species, keep still and listen.
Okay. Sorry. I'm listening.
Right. Apparently, the dodo was a very peculiar odd bird.
Hey, watch it.
Oh, sorry. And also, apparently, this rare bird was a sort of pigeon, but much bigger. It was the size and weight of a turkey, but had the gullet and gizzard of a pigeon, which allowed it to digest tough seeds. It had huge feet, tiny wings, an enormous funny beak, and 3 plumes on his backside.
Look, I warned you.
No, it's true. It could have flown if it had wanted, but it lost the ability because of the lack of predators, and so it waddled instead. It lived a quiet life on Mauritius, just pottering around. It only had one mate, one egg a year that both parents took turns sitting on. Then man arrived. Exactly. Dodo meat wasn't like chicken, but the starving sailors who landed on Mauritius didn't worry about that. And as dodos had never seen enemies before, they happily ran up to these newcomers as if to say hello to them. They didn't realise what was going on, but the sailors who killed thousands of dodos were not the only ones responsible for the dodo's extinction. Shortly afterwards, settlers arrived with their dogs, cats, pigs and rats. All of them took an immediate liking to dodo eggs. As a consequence, in 1680, only 170 years after the discovery of Mauritius, the dodo was nothing more than a memory. And that's the story. Would you like to play cards?
Oh, yeah! They exterminated my species, and now they put up statues in my honour. They dedicate a museum to me. They make money out of me. Humans are weird.
Those humans weren't the same as us.
But they were humans.
In those days, they weren't aware of the damage they was doing.
They should have been like me. Clever. Food! Food! Oh! What was that? Lummy!
Eyes what was going on.
Oh! What was that? Lummy!
Sorry about that. Something went wrong with the video. I'm rectifying it now.
Geoffrey, do you want to come back up? I think we have issues playing the Dodo cartoon.
Yeah, I gather that. I can go back on. Hello. We're going back onto the live broadcast again because it seems that we can't get the videos to stream, and apologies for that. It's one of the challenges of the Zoom world. And really, I should apologize as well because I've been trying to produce a self-contained video that we could show to avoid exactly this kind of thing. And I just didn't quite make the starting gate today. So In any case, we're going to continue now. We've had the 10 minutes, even if we haven't had the cartoon, and we're going to continue to go from transport to the I'm sorry, there's a funny comment in the chat about the dodo disappeared years ago. Thank you for that. To look at another vital component of the travel and tourism ecosystem, and this is the tour operators, the people who are putting together the trips, particularly for leisure travelers, less used by business travelers. And this is a very important layer in the interaction between companies and communities and consumers. It's that way the consumer can find the different elements of the tourism value chain and have them put together by experts in the field. And increasingly, the issue of sustainability and now climate change have become a growing part of the activities of the tour operators. And we've got presentations from two of the leading tour operators in Southeast Asia. And I know both of the CEOs very well, and they're both absolutely committed to incorporating climate-friendly travel into their products and their offerings for customers. First, we're going to hear from Wilhelm Neumann, who is the CEO and founder of Yana Adventures and Kiri Travel. And Willem made a presentation in the Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific components of the SAIS conference. And his company and he himself are completely committed to producing a sustainable and as limited carbon as possible form of transport for their customers. So if you could play Willem's video and then we'll have a look at Hamish's afterwards.
Greetings from Bangkok, Strong Earth Youth Summit. I'm glad to be here and honored to be here. Thank you, Geoffrey Lipman, for inviting me to talk about corporate commitment to climate-friendly travel, which is very close to my heart. I've only 7 minutes. I'm very well aware that that is very, very short. So I'll share my screen and go along on the presentation that I just made. So let me share my screen here. I hope it works in one go. There we go. Okay. Well, first of all, let me start with the statement that travel and tourism is essential. If there was ever a time that it is shown that it is essential, it is right now. I'm reporting from the Mekong region, where all of our countries have been closed for the last full year. So borders closed and people have lost their incomes and their livelihoods because of these closed borders. Thailand, for example, where I am, 20% of its GDP at the very least is coming from tourism. So having no tourism at all is really harmful. Now, what can tourism do to help to alleviate some of the massive problems that the world is facing? And I take out four, and I take out these four because they are positive trends that actually tourism can leverage into using itself as a tourism as a force for good. So these are not all the problems that we solve, that we face, but at least a few that tourism can help with. Let me start by the number one, and that's poverty. As you can see from this graph, poverty overall is coming down precipitously in the world. The red line is East Asia and Pacific, and you can see that it's really coming down really, really fast. In the insert, you can see a photo of a cycling company in Cambodia, and Siem Reap to be exact, that is helping travelers to explore Angkor by bicycle. Now, you have to realize that in 1993, Cambodia had nothing. It just came out of a civil war and actually decades of war. So you can see that in 30, 40 years, a country can really develop very, very fast and come out of poverty. This is why these lines are coming down, partly why these lines are coming down so precipitously. What can travel and tourism do? Well, they can engage the poorer countries. Travelers can travel there, and entrepreneurs and travel companies can put their money in countries like this and development in countries like this. Then we got overpopulation. I think for tourism, development in general, it's worth looking at population density, like in a graph like this. And you can see that population density is not equal around the world. So without going into the details, you can imagine that the travel and tourism industry can do a lot with facts like this in order to develop in a sustainable way. By and large, world population growth rates is going down as well, and this is good news for the future. This, of course, is well into the future because our overall life expectancy is going up as well, which is good news. The red line is behind us, the blue line is in front of us. I'm not quite sure, nobody's quite sure about the blue line, but it looks like the red line over the past will continue on going down, and that is going to help us. Another one where tourism can help really a lot is in preventing deforestation and in assisting conservation of natural areas. As a matter of fact, about 23%, or actually tropical forest cover can help mitigating climate change by 23%, just by keeping tropical forest cover as it is right now, and think about only in regrowing and regenerating this. This is actually a slide, or this is a photo of one of our other companies. This is a Cardamom tented camp in the west of Cambodia. It helps to conserve 180 square kilometers of lowland rainforest, and we help the conservation efforts of Wildlife Alliance, which is active in this area as well. We are completely off the grid, completely solar powered, and our guests contribute to the conservation of this area. This is also part of the problem, is pollution. One of the issues that we have to deal with, in particular here in the Mekong region, is that we depend on long-haul flights or medium-haul flights for travelers to come here. So we depend on the airline industry to do more when it comes to their emissions. Harold Goodwin, who is actually also part of Sonex, has been working hard on this as well, and has been publishing, co-authoring for the WTM an interesting article on how airlines can do more. We agree with that article, but at the same time, what can we do in the travel industry? We are dependent on the airlines to come here. We can help them by working together with REDD plus projects there throughout the world. And we also have to recognize that the airline industry has been growing very, very fast, as you can see from their emissions in the red graph here. But I can see in the blue graph, they also have been working on their efficiency, and they have become much more efficient over their growth period as well. More needs to be done, but this is up to the airline industry and their innovation as well. What can we do on the ground? we can make sure that our travelers do less when it comes to short-haul travel, short-haul flights when they are in the destination, and engage more in slow travel. Making the most of each moment is one of the slogans that Peel Travel is now using in promoting their programs as well. My time is up, but before I go there, one more issue when it comes to positive news, and that is when it comes to competition, the travel industry, the competition is playing out along the triple bottom line. It's no longer the one that makes the most money will survive. It is the ones that contribute to environmental conservation and to community engagement. These are all very good and positive changes, and it shows that tourism can be a force for good. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen and
Well, I think we're clearly having recording challenges today. And let me say, just so that everybody knows, the responsibility for that falls with me and not with the excellent team of our student volunteers who are working on this. I was very late in producing what I needed to do for this session, and they're taking the brunt of the challenges. But I think we got pretty much all of Wilhelm's presentation, and it shows how one company, and he's not the only one by any means, TUI, the big tour operator, have been doing enormous amounts in the sustainability field for many, many years. And there are other leaders around. We're going to hear from one, hopefully now, from Exo Travel. Just before that, I want to make a point. Wilhelm showed a graph at the end of his presentation, which showed the triple bottom line between economic, social, and environmental issues. I think it gets changed a bit. Somebody puts profits and people and purpose in there, but it's always seen as a triple bottom line. And I would like anybody on this call to think that that is a yesterday's analysis. There is no longer a triple bottom line. There is a quadruple bottom line, and that is climate, because climate is the existential issue. And it doesn't matter what you do in any other area. If we can't get a grip and get our hands around this climate challenge, everything in the other area will become marginal. And, you know, I've described it elsewhere as it's like you're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and it's really important. But there's the iceberg, and if you don't have somebody who says, hey, we must turn the ship so we don't hit the iceberg, that's the real crunch. And that's the whole point about climate change. If we don't get it right, it gets worse and worse, and the floods get worse, and the sea level rise gets worse, and a place like Bangladesh loses 2 million people like that. And this is foreseen by the scientists if we don't, along with the rest of society, get a control first on our carbon emissions and then on all our greenhouse gases. And Maurice Strong said it 50 years ago, this is the defining challenge for humanity. You saw that in the video clip yesterday. So now we're going to play one more presentation, and this is from a competitor of Wilhelm's, Exo Travel, another splendid company. We've been working in SunX Malta for the past 2 years they have a dedicated foundation for sustainable development issues, and we've been working with them to help develop climate champions from their networks in Cambodia and in Bali. So I can vouch that this is a company which is taking money and putting it into a dedicated foundation to attack these issues. I don't know if we're able to show Hamish's video, are we, Ariana?
From Earth Youth Summit.
My name is Hamish Keith.
Can you hear?
If it can be louder, it would be better.
That's the maximum I have on my laptop.
And I'm the CEO of EXO Travel Group, a leading destination management company in Asia with operations in Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Japan. Today, I want to talk about how we engage with communities to deliver on our goals to be a responsible travel operator and promote sustainable travel within the countries we operate. EXO Travel has been operating since 1993, and as a destination management company, we're the people on the ground delivering the final services to tourists and travelers, and in doing so, engage with communities on a daily basis. Before COVID, we had 980 people working full-time in 10 countries, and in 2019, we welcomed 160,000 travelers to our destinations. EXO operates across a number of segments, including luxury travel, adventure travel, and group touring, and our focus is on tailor-made experiential travel, authenticity, and sustainability. This is, of course, a challenge for a large organization. So we have developed a deep and sincere commitment to sustainable travel and have enshrined a promise to be responsible within our company values and embrace sustainability not only as a core component of our company culture, but as a foundation pillar for our business strategy. We have an active foundation headed by a very capable director of sustainability, plus sustainability coordinators in all our destinations. In addition, we're third-party certified by Travel Life and undergo biannual audits, as well as being part of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, an active participant in SunX, and many other initiatives. We engage our community every day and on multiple levels, and therefore feel very responsible for the impact of tourism on the environment and on those communities. We actively engage on climate action through education programs for our employees, suppliers, and local communities. We're able to measure, reduce, and compensate for our emissions through carbon credits and have a goal in place to be fully carbon neutral, not only as a company, which we've already achieved, but for the entire in-country carbon footprint of all of our guests. We ensure education and awareness runs right through our supply chain through an active education program to share best practices with our suppliers. We deliver on our emission compensation through tree planting programs and campaign hard to reduce single-use plastic. We engage the wider travel community by spearheading stakeholder groups and have created or co-founded networks to raise awareness in our communities at the grassroots level. Many communities in our destinations are extremely vulnerable to changes in the ecosystem or climate, and we provide direct support via our foundation, as well as investing in communities to protect the environment, which we do through the Kalawet organization, which has been fighting for the preservation of biodiversity in Indonesia by purchasing private forest reserves to protect animals from palm oil plantations and also from tourism. Through our foundation, we've invested in significant projects. Some examples are the Gaya Siem Reap, which is the first and only glass recycling center in Cambodia that transforms glass into sand for the construction industry, and Reform in Vietnam, which turns non-recyclable plastic waste into furniture and is an outstanding example of how social enterprise can work sustainably to benefit the local community and improve the overall tourism experience. We support and engage communities through education. As part of their jobs, EXO staff train students on environmental issues from Saleh Baig School in Cambodia and the University of Phnom Penh, and have trained 900 students in 2 years. We have a strong cooperation with SunX to develop climate-friendly travel for students in Indonesia and Cambodia, and have developed partnerships with universities in Phnom Penh and in Bali. We empower communities to create and deliver travel experiences for our visitors, and have developed a comprehensive rating system to evaluate the sustainability practices of the travel experiences and tours that we operate. We have in total over 421 experiences listed as responsible on our website. Some examples of projects that we support, work closely with, and support through our travel programs are shown here, including a project at Busra Eco Park, where all local vendors are now using reusable cutlery and have become guardians of their own environment.
And I would like to especially mention the people of Hue Pu Keng, a Kayar village in Mae Hong Son province in Thailand. The Kayar are people from Myanmar that migrated to Thailand many years ago and had suffered exploitation as part of a human zoo that was encouraged by tourism and local tour operators. The community is now working with an NGO called Fair Tourism on a path towards sustainability and self-reliance to develop non-exploitative tourism programs and welcome visitors on their own terms. This is a powerful example of how positive engagement by stakeholders in tourism can repair some of the wrongs that were in fact created in some respects by tourism in the first place. Like most of us, I believe travel and tourism is a powerful force that none of us can resist. And the deep longing for travel we all feel during this imposed hiatus reinforces the fact that travel will return in force. And while like any powerful force, it can overconsume or cause harm to the environment, travel and tourism also has the capacity to do enormous good and contains all the elements to make it self-sustainable. Of course, this takes work, energy, effort, education, engagement, and vision. And as we adjust to a future that we believe will be more aware and demand more responsibility from all of us, the stakeholders, it's ever more important that we all work together to plan a path ahead that really is sustainable. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to fielding any questions during the Q&A later.
You're good to go, Jeffrey. Thank you for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think we've had enough videos for today, and we're going to go to a half-an-hour session of question and answers. We'll try it again live. It seemed to work quite well yesterday. We like to think that we're innovative and responsive to change. So if anybody has a question or a comment or wants to start a round of questions, just raise your hand and we'll recognize you. You switch on your microphone and we'll try to take it live. If you prefer to just ask a question in the chat, a couple of our team are watching the chat, so you put it in there and I will try to fudge the answers. Yeah, we have a question from Dinara Ismail asking if the presentations and videos will be available, and the answer is yes, they will.
Jeffrey, there was a question earlier in the chat from Pascaline asking if there are, well, the negative effects of climate change are obvious. Sorry. So she was wondering if there were some positive effects at all of climate change.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. There was a question in the chat asking if there were some positive effects of climate change. And the fact is, there are some. I mean, you can be living in a climate where, let's just take an example, where you have very short summer months, and because of climate change, your summer can extend. And where you didn't have a very vibrant tourism sector because of the weather, suddenly you may have an opportunity that didn't exist before. I think if you look at a map of the world, you're going to find that the worst places that are going to suffer tend to be in the hottest places already. That's kind of logical. So I can't see too many beneficial effects coming to what's known as the South. The Northern Hemisphere, Europe, seems to be, if you look at the data, it's going to get warmer and that may do something to help the perennial miserable winters and falls and springs. But the effects, the beneficial effects, are much less likely to really help people compared to the negative effects. And there are some overall developments. You know, people gloss over the migration impact of climate change. The figures show currently there are over 100 million refugees that the UN attributes to climate-related activities. It's mostly droughts. It could be also adverse economic impacts. Tourism reduces, food production reduces, tensions arise, so you get wars, and when times are hard, people turn increasingly in today's world, and driven by multimedia, people turn to blaming somebody else, and that's when you get tribal challenges, and one group of people turn against another group of people because they don't look the same, or they don't worship the same, or they don't sound the same. And I think we're going to see an escalation of this. And so I think those kind of negative effects, there are some places which have really severe problems on the coast. And some of the major cities in the world are coastal cities. And you can see what happens. It's not just that the water rises, it's that you get flood surges, or you get a water rise which is combined with a wind, hurricane or cyclone. And the consequences of that can be devastating, as we saw in the southern United States and in New York, when, you know, in the subways, you suddenly see that there are rivers running in the subways where the trains run. So the beneficial effects, to me, are going to be quite limited. And it's not just saying, yes, in a certain country, there is going to be impact X. First of all, people don't know what those impacts are going to be. Secondly, there are some developments that they call feedback loops. A feedback loop is where something happens and it triggers something else, and you can't stop it because one feeds against the other. So the tundra in the Siberia, which is currently experiencing a burning. This has been frozen for centuries. It's suddenly burning, and it shows that the burning releases gases, and the gases, they believe, may have viruses, new forms of viruses which human beings have not been basically exposed to, so develop very little or no immunity. And again, this isn't the obvious consequence you see, a forest fire. The sequoias are burning in the national parks in the United States. That's terrible, it's a tragedy. But these are things which are secondary impacts and accelerating impacts. They say that the Gulf Stream is going to badly suffer. The Gulf Stream is that warm water which flows from the Gulf of Mexico across the Atlantic and keeps Western Europe relatively warm during the autumn and the winter. Well, if the Gulf Stream screws up, you're going to have terrible consequences and even worse winters than we currently have in Western Europe. So these negative impacts are really the potentially damaging ones. I'm trying to see if there are any more.
Right. We have another question, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Just now, I just saw one.
I've seen one from Patricia Reyes.
Yeah, I'm looking for that.
Would you include in the curriculum this week how to engage and influence community stakeholders in pilot testing work similar to what EXO Travel had presented? Patricia, I think the answer to the question is no, we can't include it in the curriculum because it's already been established, and we have some other speakers who are lining up for tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. But I think it's the kind of thing that if you communicate with us afterwards, we could, it's an interesting question, and we could see how we might look at that. I think EXO, as you've observed, are really committed in this field, and it may be that we can somehow learn some more from them about what there is to do. And thank you for your kind comments, Patricia, about the presentations.
Yeah, and we have another question from Nelson. I think domestic tourism is good for the climate, but what would be the impact on developing economies where domestic tourism is very limited? Doesn't that exclude these developing countries from the global tourism economy?
I'm not sure that domestic tourism is particularly good for the climate, Nelson. You can argue that because people travel shorter distances, that's beneficial for the climate. And I think you can make a case, but the impact, I suspect, is quite marginal if you look at how much travel is in the total picture, and then you say, and how much of that will be limited by people not going abroad. You know, you might get a 10% reduction somewhere in overall industry climate consequences. I'm picking that number out of the air, but it's more of that order of magnitude. And you ask a second question, what would be the impact on developing economies where domestic tourism is very limited? And I actually think the impact on domestic tourism, if it's a substitution for international tourism, there's no doubt that that there's likely to be an adverse financial impact, because your foreign tourists coming in represent an export. They take money from their earnings in their country, they pay to come to your country, and then you take the benefit of their money in your economy. So that's very important, and usually because they're paying in high denomination currencies, you get a real benefit because you're getting dollars or euros that will help your economic development. But what has been shown during the COVID crisis is when you're faced with an emergency, domestic tourism does offer some real possibilities, even in the poorest of countries, because people who would afford to be able to go and travel somewhere else, if they travel, they have to keep that money contained in the national economy. And that will help to reduce the imports. When a traveler leaves a developing country and goes somewhere else, he's making an import in the developing country because he's taking his money and spending it, or her money and spending it in another economy. But if you can contain that within the economy, and you can stimulate domestic tourism, it can provide some real benefits. And in many countries, there are large groups of people who could not afford to travel internationally, or don't have passports, or simply are not attuned to international traveling. And I think that's a sort of latent market that has been discovered during the COVID crisis, where people have actually increased their focus on domestic tourism. And then I want to give you one other point, and it's a really important point, and it's China. China, when I was working in China in the 1990s with the National Tourism Administration, when WTTC took groups of chief executives in to help them with their planning for a tourism which didn't exist at that time. There was no domestic tourism in China. And they had a plan, like so many things in China, which they shared with us, and we offered thoughts and comments on it. And their plan was for 10 to 15 years into the future, how they would grow a domestic tourism economy. And I read recently that the domestic tourism in China is dramatically bigger than all of the international tourism combined. It's huge. And the Chinese have a capacity. I have a film that I wanted to show, but we didn't have time today, but I'll try and show you later in the week, of a friend, Peggy Liu, who is a brilliant, brilliant Chinese entrepreneur, not in the tourism business. And she has a video which shows how China is dealing with climate. And it's incredible. They're the biggest polluter in the world. They have more coal-fired energy systems than anywhere in the world. And they have plans which are more aggressive than anybody in the world to respond to it. And when they do something, they do it on a coordinated basis, and they do it at scale. And just where I wandered slightly on that point, but the domestic tourism in China, in 1999, they decided to create what they called red tourism. And I repeat, there was very little tourism domestically before that. And red tourism was promoting places where Chairman Mao had stopped on his long march. So they had a kind of cultural stopping places where they'd put heritage sites and temples and Buddhas and all of that kind of thing. And last time I looked at it, they had 500 million tourists doing red tourism from nothing in 1999. So you can see how, if you're a well-organized economy, even if you're a developing, China's a sort of funny developing country because it has masses of poverty, but it's the second biggest economy in the world. It still has a developing nation status inside the United Nations. And nobody else can do what China is doing, but you can do some of it. And there is a capacity in most countries for making domestic tourism much better.
So I'm not seeing any specific questions about the presentation, but I know a lot of people are asking about the video. And most likely one of us would send the link to the videos in the chat. They're also accessible on YouTube.
Oh, Nust. Or Liesel, whichever name you prefer to go by. Yeah, it's a video. It's actually up on YouTube now, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the program. We'll look at the program after today, and we will see if there's a place to show Peggy's video. I'd really like you all to see it, but if we don't have the space, in one of the future sessions, we'll give you a link to it. And there's a question about the site in China, and it's not just one site. The Long March was, sort of 2-year march where Chairman Mao retreated because he was losing the civil war, and he took his people on a long march into the mountains where he regrouped and then came out and won the civil war. And the places where they stopped on that journey became kind of heritage places, cultural sites. And it was not used for tourism. They were just places that people who felt they'd had an incredible journey together created some sort of memorable experience place. But it was the China National Tourism Administration said, let's make this a circuit. Let's make these advertised tourism places. Let's make sure there's hospitality facilities, hotels. Let's improve the roads to the sites. And they've turned it into a massive, massive tourism exercise. I don't see any more questions, and I don't see any more hands being held up. And sorry?
I said me either. I'm not seeing anything else.
Okay, well, I'm always of the opinion if we've run out of questions and to answer that it's a good time to bring the session to a close. I would like to thank those people who came. We had pretty much 80 people throughout the whole thing, which is really very good. They came from around the world. And I'd like to invite you to join us again tomorrow at 1300. We'll try and get our communications a little bit better. I'll try and do my homework a little bit better. And we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much for being with you today. And thank you, Martina, for your kind words. Thank you.